We had been planning this vacation for months, maybe even longer. Our marriage had felt different lately, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't as if we fought much. In fact, we rarely did. But something had shifted, like the tides beneath us, subtle but undeniable. As I sat on the balcony of our hotel room, the ocean stretched out in front of me, endless and serene. The air smelled of salt water and sunscreen, a mixture that usually relaxed me. But not today. Today I felt uneasy, though I couldn't figure out why. Daniel had gone down to the beach earlier. He said he wanted to stretch his legs after the long flight, while I stayed behind, unpacking and settling into our little slice of paradise. I didn't mind at first. I thought it would be nice to have a moment to myself, to breathe and soak in the view before joining him. But an hour passed. Then too, I started to wonder where he was. I wandered down to the beach, the hot sand slipping between my toes as I scanned the crowd for him. The sun was starting to set, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. I should have been basking in the beauty of it all, but my stomach was tight with a growing sense of anxiety. Finally, I saw him. His dark hair, slightly tousled by the ocean breeze, was unmistakable. But he wasn't alone. A woman stood next to him, laughing at something he had said. She was beautiful, in a carefree, beachy sort of way, long blonde hair cascading down her back, a bikini that left little to the imagination. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. They could have just met on the beach, shared some small talk. After all, Daniel had always been friendly, charming even. It was one of the things that had drawn me to him. But the way she looked at him, with those bright, flirtatious eyes, sent a shiver down my spine. And worse, the way he leaned toward her, so casually, like he had known her for more than just a few hours. I froze, standing a few feet away, watching them. They hadn't noticed me yet. I could see the way she touched his arm, playfully, like she was testing the waters. And he didn't pull away. In fact, he smiled at her, that same smile he used to give me when we first started dating. The sting of betrayal was subtle at first, like the faint touch of a jellyfish in the water, just a twinge of discomfort. But then it grew, spreading through my chest, tightening my throat. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, hurt, disbelief. I should have stormed over there, should have said something. But instead, I just stood there, watching as my husband flirted with another woman in the middle of what was supposed to be our vacation. They eventually began walking back up the beach, side by side, laughing like old friends. I didn't follow them, couldn't. Instead, I turned and walked in the opposite direction, the waves crashing behind me as the sun dipped lower in the sky. When I finally made it back to our hotel room, Daniel was already there, showered and dressed for dinner. He greeted me with that same easy smile, the one that used to make my heart flutter but now just felt hollow. "Where have you been?" he asked, his tone casual as if nothing had happened. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide how to respond. Should I confront him right then? Should I demand to know who that woman was? But something held me back. Maybe it was the fear of what he might say, or worse, what he wouldn't say. "I went for a walk," I replied, my voice sounding distant, even to me. "Good idea," he said, not picking up on my discomfort. "The beach is incredible, isn't it? Perfect weather today." I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, I was screaming. How could he act so normal? How could he pretend like everything was fine, when just hours ago, he had been wrapped up in the attention of another woman? As we made our way to dinner, I kept replaying the scene on the beach in my head. Every laugh, every smile, every casual touch. It was like a loop, haunting me with questions I couldn't answer. Who was she? How long had this been going on? Was it just a harmless flirtation? Or was there something more? Throughout dinner, I watched him carefully. He seemed relaxed, maybe even more so than usual. He talked about the day, about how excited he was for the rest of the week, but I could barely focus. Every time he mentioned the beach, I wondered if he was thinking about her, too. At one point, I caught him glancing at his phone under the table, his fingers quickly tapping out a message before setting it face down beside his plate. My heart sank. Was he texting her? I couldn't bring myself to ask. Not yet. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. We returned to the hotel room, and though he reached for me in bed, I turned away, feigning exhaustion. In truth, I couldn't bear the thought of being close to him, not while my mind was swirling with suspicion and doubt. That night, as I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. Tomorrow I would find out the truth. I had to. The next morning, I woke up early, the sound of waves crashing against the shore pulling me from a restless sleep. Daniel was still in bed, his breathing slow and steady, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I slipped out of the room quietly, my mind racing as I made my way down to the beach. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, but I had to see if she was there. If they were there. The beach was mostly empty, save for a few early risers strolling along the shoreline. I scanned the area, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw her. She was sitting on a towel, alone this time, her sunglasses perched on top of her head as she sipped a coffee, watching the ocean. My throat tightened. She looked so calm, so at ease, like she didn't have a care in the world. I wanted to march over to her, demand to know what was going on between her and my husband, but I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if I was making something out of nothing? But then, as if sensing my presence, she looked up, her eyes meeting mine across the sand. For a brief moment, I saw something flicker in her expression. Recognition. Maybe? Guilt? It was enough to make my blood run cold. I turned on my heel and walked away, my heart racing. I couldn't do this. Not yet. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The rest of the morning was a blur. I wandered through the streets near the hotel, trying to calm my mind, but nothing worked. My thoughts kept spiraling back to that woman on the beach, the look in her eyes when she saw me. What was it? Recognition? Or just my imagination running wild? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening right under my nose, something I wasn't ready to face. By the time I returned to the hotel, Daniel was awake, showered, and sipping coffee on the balcony. He smiled at me when I walked in, his carefree expression sending a wave of nausea through me. I tried to smile back, but my face felt frozen. "Morning, sleepyhead," he said, his tone warm and familiar. "You were out early. Did you go for a walk again?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He had no idea how close I was to exploding, how every word he said felt like a lie, even if it wasn't. "We should head to the market later," he continued, clearly unaware of my inner turmoil. "They've got all sorts of local crafts and stuff. Maybe we could find something nice for the house." I forced a smile, nodding again. "Yeah, that sounds nice." But inside, I was already planning my next move. I needed answers, and I needed them soon. Later that afternoon, as we strolled through the bustling market, I couldn't shake the unease. Every time Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket, I felt a jolt of fear. Was it her? Were they exchanging messages while I stood right beside him? I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, searching for any sign that he was hiding something, but he seemed completely at ease. Too at ease. As we wandered past the colorful stalls, he stopped to admire a handmade wooden sculpture. I lingered behind him, pretending to be interested in a row of woven baskets. My mind was elsewhere, trying to come up with a plan to confront him, to get to the bottom of this. But every time I thought about it, my chest tightened with fear. What if he denied everything? What if it was all in my head? Just then, his phone buzzed again. This time, I couldn't resist. As he bent down to inspect the sculpture more closely, I casually glanced at the screen. A single name flashed across the display: Lena. My heart stopped. Who was Lena? I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it could be anyone. A friend, a colleague, someone from home. But deep down, I knew. I had seen that woman on the beach. I had seen the way she looked at him. And now I had a name to go with the face. Suddenly, the market felt too crowded, too loud. I needed to get out of there. I needed air. "I'm feeling a little lightheaded," I said quickly, stepping back from the stall. "I think I'll head back to the hotel for a bit." Daniel looked up, concern flickering across his face. "Are you okay? Do you want me to come with you?" "No," I said a little too quickly. "I'll be fine. Just need to lie down for a while." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, I'll be back soon." As I walked away, my heart pounded in my ears. I felt sick, dizzy with a mixture of anger and fear. Who was this woman? How long had this been going on? I needed answers, and I needed them now. Back in the hotel room, I paced back and forth, my thoughts racing. I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to know the truth, even if it meant shattering the fragile illusion that had been holding our marriage together. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking as I reached for Daniel's phone, still sitting on the nightstand where he had left it. I wasn't proud of what I was about to do. Invading someone's privacy was something I had always told myself I'd never do. But this wasn't just about privacy anymore. This was about my marriage, my life, and the sinking feeling in my gut that something was terribly wrong. I unlocked his phone. He had never bothered to change the passcode. My fingers hovered over the Messages app for a moment before I tapped it, my breath catching in my throat. There it was. Lena. A whole string of messages, dating back to last week. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. They had been talking for days, maybe longer. My vision blurred as I scrolled through the messages, each one feeling like a punch to the gut. There was nothing explicit, nothing that screamed affair. But the flirtation was undeniable. The jokes, the inside references, the plans to meet up at the beach. All of it felt like a betrayal. And then there was one message that made my blood run cold. Lena. Can't wait to see you again tomorrow. Same time? Daniel, of course. Can't stay away from you. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me, my hands trembling. My worst fears were confirmed. Daniel was meeting her. He had lied to me, flirted with her, maybe more, and he was doing it again tomorrow. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? Confront him? Leave? I didn't have a plan. All I knew was that my marriage, the life I had built with this man, was falling apart right in front of me, and I didn't know how to stop it. When Daniel returned, he was carrying a small bag from the market, a proud smile on his face. "I got us something," he said, holding it out to me. I couldn't even look at him. The sight of his face, the sound of his voice, it all felt like a lie. "I know about her," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. He froze, his smile fading. "What are you talking about?" "Lena," I said, finally looking up at him, my eyes burning with unshed tears. "I saw the messages. I know you've been meeting her." For a moment he said nothing, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he sat down on the edge of the bed, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "It's not what you think," he said finally, his voice tight. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the quiet room. "Isn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I think. You've been lying to me, Daniel. You've been seeing her behind my back." He shook his head, but the guilt in his eyes was impossible to miss. "I swear, nothing has happened. We met on the beach and we talked, that's all. It was innocent." "Innocent," I repeated, my voice rising. "You're planning to meet her again tomorrow. Is that innocent too?" His silence was answer enough. The tension between us hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I could feel my heart racing, my pulse quickening as Daniel sat there, silent, unable to offer me any real explanation. I didn't know whether to scream or cry, or maybe both. It felt like the man I had married was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize. "I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have met her. I shouldn't have—" He stopped, as if the words were too heavy to say out loud. "But you did," I said, my voice trembling. "You met her and you kept meeting her. And now you're telling me it was a mistake? After everything?" He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders slumping under the weight of it all. I don't know what I was thinking. I wasn't planning on anything happening. It just felt good to talk to someone, to feel noticed. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Noticed? Was that it? He didn't feel noticed by me? After everything we had been through, after all the years of marriage, it came down to that. "I notice you, Daniel," I said, my voice breaking. "I've always noticed you. But you didn't even try to talk to me. You went looking for someone else." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. After the confrontation, the room felt heavy, like the weight of our words hung in the air, refusing to settle. Daniel sat there, defeated, his head in his hands, while I stood by the window, staring out at the ocean. It was ironic how peaceful the view looked. Waves gently rolling in. The sky streaked with soft hues of pink and orange as the sun began to set. Meanwhile, inside, our marriage was crumbling. We didn't say much after that. What was there to say? His apology, if it could even be called that, wasn't enough to undo the damage. And I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. I was drained emotionally, mentally. I felt like I was floating through a nightmare, unsure if I would ever wake up. "I'll sleep on the couch tonight," Daniel muttered after a long stretch of silence. He stood up slowly, avoiding eye contact, and moved to grab a pillow from the bed. For a second, I almost stopped him. Almost. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed space. I needed to think. As he set up his makeshift bed on the couch, I watched him from the corner of my eye. There was a sadness in the way he moved, as though he knew just how much he had broken. I wondered if he felt the same ache that was burning inside me, or if his guilt was the only thing keeping him in this room. Part of me wanted to ask, to hear his side of things, but I didn't trust myself to handle whatever answer he might give. I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, the sheets feeling cold and unfamiliar without him beside me. It was strange how quickly things had changed. Just a few days ago, we were planning this vacation as a way to reconnect, to find our way back to each other. Now, it felt like we were miles apart, even though he was only a few feet away. The nights stretched on, and despite my exhaustion, I couldn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop racing, replaying the events of the day, the weeks before, searching for signs I had missed. Had I been too blind, too trusting? I kept thinking back to the woman on the beach, Lena. Her name echoed in my mind, taunting me. How long had she been in his life? Was she just a vacation fling? Or was there more to it? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the way she laughed with him, the way he leaned toward her. It was all too much. At some point in the middle of the night, I heard Daniel shift on the couch. For a moment, I thought he was coming back to bed, but he stayed put. I wondered if he was sleeping, if his mind was as restless as mine. Did he regret what he had done? Or was he simply regretting that he had been caught? The next morning, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. I woke up before Daniel, slipping out of bed quietly and heading to the balcony. The air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. I wrapped a blanket around myself, sinking into the chair as I watched the early risers set up their towels on the beach below. It was so strange, watching the world go on as if nothing had changed. Couples held hands, kids played in the sand, families laughed together. It made me wonder how many of them were going through something similar. How many smiles were hiding pain? How many relationships were hanging by a thread just like mine? I heard the door to the balcony slide open behind me. Daniel stepped out, his hair disheveled, dark circles under his eyes. He looked as exhausted as I felt. For a moment, neither of us said anything. He stood there, leaning against the railing, staring out at the ocean. "I don't know how to fix this," he said softly, breaking the silence. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure if there was anything to fix. Could we really come back from this? Trust, once broken, wasn't something that could easily be repaired. I had no idea where to even begin. "I don't know either," I finally admitted. My voice was hoarse, thick with emotion. "I don't even know where we go from here." He let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I wish I could take it all back. I wish I hadn't." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, I saw the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had once promised me forever. But that man had betrayed me, and no amount of regret would erase that fact. Why? I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Why did you do it? He hesitated, looking down at his feet. I don't know, he said, his voice heavy with shame. I wasn't thinking. I was lost. Things between us haven't been the same for a while, and I guess I was looking for something. Some kind of escape, I don't know. But it was stupid. I never meant for it to go this far. His words stung even though I had expected them. Hearing him admit that our marriage wasn't enough for him anymore was like a dagger to the heart. But there was a small part of me that understood. We hadn't been the same lately. The distance between us had been growing, and neither of us had done much to bridge it. Why didn't you talk to me? I asked, my voice trembling. Why didn't you tell me how you were feeling instead of turning to her? He shook his head, a pained expression on his face. I didn't know how to. Every time I thought about bringing it up, it felt easier to pretend everything was fine. I didn't want to hurt you. I laughed bitterly at that. Well, you've done a hell of a job avoiding that. He winced, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the messages, the lies, the woman on the beach, and my anger flared up again. So what now? I asked, my voice colder than I intended. What do we do now, Daniel? Do you want to be with her? Do you even want to try to fix this? His eyes widened, and he shook his head quickly. No, God, no. I don't want to be with her. It was never about that. I don't even know her, not really. It was just a distraction. A distraction? I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. From what? From me. From everything, he said, his voice cracking. From the pressure, from feeling like we were falling apart. I'm not making excuses, but that's the truth. I messed up. I know that. But I don't want to lose you. His words hung in the air, and for the first time, I saw the fear in his eyes. Fear of losing me, of losing what we had built together. It was the most real thing he had said since this whole nightmare began. But was it enough? The rest of the day was a blur. We didn't talk much after our conversation on the balcony. I think we were both too drained, emotionally spent from everything that had come to light. Daniel tried to act normal, suggesting we go to the pool, maybe grab lunch at the little cafe by the beach. But I couldn't bring myself to play along. I needed time to think, to process everything that had happened. I ended up spending most of the day by myself, wandering through the small town near the resort, trying to make sense of my thoughts. Every time I thought I had a handle on how I felt, a new wave of emotion would hit me. Anger, sadness, disbelief. It was a constant cycle, and I didn't know how to break free from it. When I finally returned to the hotel, the sun was setting again, casting a golden glow over everything. I found Daniel on the balcony, a glass of wine in his hand, staring out at the ocean. He looked lost in thought, and for a brief moment, I saw the vulnerability in him, the pain he was feeling. It wasn't just me who was suffering, he was too. We need to talk, I said softly, stepping out onto the balcony. He glanced up at me, his eyes weary, and nodded. I know, he replied, setting his glass down on the table. I've been thinking about everything all day. I know I've hurt you. I know I messed up in a way that might be unforgivable. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. I don't know how to move past this, Daniel. I don't know if I can. I'll do whatever it takes, he said quickly, his voice desperate. I'll go to counseling. I'll do anything. Just, please, don't give up on us. His words were sincere, but they didn't erase the betrayal. I wanted to believe him, to believe that we could fix this, but the reality of what had happened was still too fresh, too raw. I don't know, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. I don't know if love is enough anymore. The weight of my words hung between us like an anchor, dragging us both down into the depths of uncertainty. Daniel didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and hurt. I had never said anything like that to him before. For years, we had believed that love would carry us through any storm. But now, standing on the edge of this disaster, I wasn't sure if love was enough to salvage what we had left. He swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing as he searched for the right thing to say. What do you mean? He finally asked. His voice so quiet I almost didn't hear him. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I mean, I don't know if we can come back from this, Daniel. I don't know if we can just fix this. You didn't just make a mistake, you made a choice. You chose to turn to someone else instead of me. And that hurts more than anything. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to absorb the blow. When he opened them again, there was a raw desperation there. A plea for forgiveness that I wasn't sure I could give. I know I messed up, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But please don't say that. Don't say it's too late. I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for another chance. I looked away, my gaze drifting out over the ocean. The waves crashed against the shore in a steady rhythm, like the pulse of something far greater than either of us. For a moment, I wished I could be as calm and steady as the sea. But inside I was a storm. How do I trust you again? I asked quietly. How do I believe that this won't happen again? Daniel didn't have an answer. He just sat there, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his brow furrowed in thought. After a long stretch of silence, he spoke again. I don't have an easy answer, he admitted. I can't undo what I did, and I can't promise that you'll trust me overnight. But I'll do everything I can to earn it back, if you give me the chance. I turned to face him, my heart aching with the weight of his words. I could see the pain in his eyes, the regret that he was carrying. But I could also see the cracks in our foundation, cracks that had been there long before Lena entered the picture. We had ignored them for too long, and now they were threatening to tear us apart. Maybe we need some time apart, I said softly, the words tasting foreign on my tongue. His eyes widened in alarm. What do you mean? You want to leave? I don't know, I said, shaking my head. I need space. I need time to figure out what I really want, what we really want. This isn't something we can just rush through. We need to be honest with ourselves about where we're at. Daniel's face fell, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then, slowly, he nodded. If that's what you need, he said quietly, I'll give you space. But please, just know that I'm not giving up on us. I stood up, feeling the tension in my body unwind just a little. I'm not saying it's over, I replied, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. I'm just saying we need time, both of us. The next few days passed in a blur of half-hearted conversations and tense silences. Daniel and I stayed in the same hotel room, but it felt like we were miles apart. He slept on the couch and I kept to the bed, both of us avoiding the inevitable. It was easier, somehow, to exist in this limbo than to confront the real issues lurking beneath the surface. I spent my days walking along the beach, letting the rhythm of the waves soothe my nerves, while Daniel kept to himself, going for long runs or sitting by the pool with a book he didn't seem to be reading. We were like ghosts, moving through the same space but never really connecting. On the third day, I found myself wandering farther than usual, away from the crowded section of the beach near the resort and toward the quieter, more secluded coves. I needed to escape, to clear my head without the constant reminder of everything that had happened. The isolation gave me a strange sense of peace, but also a deep loneliness. I sat on a rock, watching the waves roll in, the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon. It was beautiful in that quiet, overwhelming way that nature always is. But even in the beauty, I felt lost. I kept replaying the events of the past week in my mind, wondering how we had ended up here. Was it my fault, too? Had I been too distant, too focused on the cracks that I didn't see him slipping away? Just as I was lost in my thoughts, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I thought it might be Daniel. But when I turned around, it wasn't him. It was her, Lena. She stood a few feet away, looking as surprised to see me as I was to see her. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she was wearing a simple sundress, the kind you'd expect to see in a beachside town. But all I could see was her, the woman who had come between me and my husband. "Hi," she said awkwardly, taking a small step forward. "I didn't mean to intrude. I I saw you sitting here. I didn't know how to respond. My chest tightened, my throat going dry as I struggled to find words. The sight of her was like a punch to the gut, a reminder of everything I was trying to escape. But at the same time, a part of me wanted answers. I needed to know why. What are you doing here? I finally managed to say, my voice hoarse. She hesitated, then sat down on a rock a few feet away from me, keeping her distance. I didn't come here looking for trouble, she said softly. I wanted to talk, if that's okay. I stared at her, my mind racing. I didn't want to talk to her. I didn't want to hear her excuses, her reasons. But at the same time, I felt an inexplicable pull. This was the woman who had been with my husband. The woman he had chosen to spend time with instead of me. Why? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Why would you want to talk to me? She sighed, looking down at her hands. Because I feel awful. And you deserve to know the truth. The truth. The word hung in the air like a dark cloud, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I could handle it. But then I nodded. Fine, I said, my heart pounding in my chest. Tell me the truth. Lena took a deep breath, clearly struggling with what she was about to say. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her, sitting there with that look of guilt on her face. But then I remembered who she was, what she had done, and any sympathy I might have felt vanished. I didn't know he was married at first, she said quietly, her voice trembling. We met on the beach just by chance. He seemed kind and we got to talking. It was just small talk, nothing serious. But then, I found out. I clenched my fists in my lap, trying to keep my emotions in check. And you didn't stop? I asked, my voice sharp. You didn't think that maybe, I don't know, you should walk away? She nodded quickly, tears welling up in her eyes. I should have. I know I should have. But by the time I realized what was happening, I was already in too deep. I liked him. He made me feel special. The word hit me like a slap in the face. Special. Was that what Daniel had been looking for? Someone to make him feel special when I apparently couldn't. You're not the only one he hurt, I said, my voice cold. He didn't just betray me. He betrayed you too. Lena wiped at her eyes, nodding. I know. I was stupid. I let myself get pulled into something I shouldn't have. And now I regret it. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her that regret wasn't enough. But another part of me felt empty, like no amount of anger would change what had happened. No amount of regret would undo the betrayal. I'm sorry, Lena whispered, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I never meant for it to go this far. I stood up, unable to sit there any longer. The sight of her, the sound of her voice, it was too much. I think we're done here, I said, my voice flat. Lena stood too, looking unsure of what to do. I understand. I just wanted to make sure you knew that. I didn't respond. I just turned and walked away, the weight of everything pressing down on me like a stone. I had thought hearing the truth would give me some kind of closure, but now all I felt was the same overwhelming emptiness that had been there all along. I walked away from Lena with my mind spinning, replaying her words over and over. She had painted herself as a victim in all of this. Someone who had made a mistake, yes, but who had also been lied to. It was hard to accept. I had wanted her to be the villain, the person who had knowingly come between me and Daniel. But the truth was more complicated than that. It always was. When I got back to the hotel, Daniel was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking up at me the second I walked through the door. His eyes were filled with a mix of hope and dread, as if he wasn't sure whether I'd come back ready to forgive him or walk out for good. Where were you? He asked, his voice soft, careful. I sat down on the chair by the window, still feeling the weight of my encounter with Lena. I ran into her, I said, not looking at him. Lena. Daniel stiffened, his hands clenching into fists. What did she say? She apologized, I said, my voice flat. She didn't know you were married at first, apparently. He let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry. I should have told you everything before it got to this point. I held up a hand, stopping him. Don't. I don't want to hear more excuses. It's too late for that. The silence between us was thick, oppressive. I could feel the tension in the room growing, like we were both standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see who would jump first. I stared out the window, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in deep hues of orange and pink. It was beautiful, but all I could think about was how far we had fallen. Do you even love me anymore? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I hadn't planned on asking that question, but it had been gnawing at me for days. I needed to hear him say it one way or another. Daniel looked at me, his eyes wide with shock. Of course I love you. How can you even ask that? Because, I said, my voice trembling. You didn't act like it. You turned to someone else when things got hard. You didn't even try to fix things with me. He stood up, pacing the room, clearly struggling to find the right words. I know I messed up. I know I should have talked to you, but I didn't know how. Things between us haven't been right for a long time, and I was scared. I didn't want to face the truth. And what truth is that? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. That we've been drifting apart, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't want to admit it because I didn't want to lose you. But the distance. It's been there for a while, and I didn't know how to fix it. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy fog. Part of me knew he was right. We had been drifting apart, but I had told myself that it was just a rough patch, that we'd find our way back to each other eventually. I never imagined it would lead to this. You should have talked to me, I whispered, feeling the sting of tears behind my eyes. Instead of running to her, you should have come to me. I know, he said, his voice breaking. I know, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But please, I'm asking for a second chance. Let me prove to you that I can do better. That I want to be better for you. I stared at him, searching his face for something. Some sign that he truly meant it, that this wasn't just another desperate attempt to fix things on the surface. But I wasn't sure if I could trust him anymore. The foundation of our marriage had been shaken, and I didn't know if I had the strength to rebuild it. I don't know, Daniel, I said, my voice shaking. I don't know if I can forgive you. His face crumpled, and he took a hesitant step toward me, but I held up my hand again, stopping him in his tracks. I need time. I can't make this decision right now. He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Take all the time you need, he said quietly. I'll wait. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I didn't respond. Couldn't. The truth was, I wasn't sure if there was anything he could do to make this right. The next few days were a strange limbo. Daniel and I barely spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The vacation that was supposed to bring us closer together had done the exact opposite. Now, every moment we spent in the same room felt like a reminder of the distance between us. I spent a lot of time by the beach, sitting alone, watching the waves roll in and out. There was something comforting about the steady rhythm of the ocean, the way it seemed to carry on, no matter what was happening around it. It made me wonder if I could be that strong, if I could weather this storm and come out the other side still standing. One afternoon, as I sat watching the horizon, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a message from my best friend, Sarah, who had no idea about what had happened between Daniel and me. I hadn't told anyone yet. I wasn't ready to let the world in on my pain. Sarah, how's the vacation going? Miss you. I stared at the message for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I wanted to tell her everything, to pour my heart out to someone who would understand. But at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to hit send. Saying it out loud, admitting that my husband had betrayed me, made it all feel too real. Instead, I typed back a simple, "It's complicated. I'll tell you everything when I get home." As I sat there, I realized how isolated I had become. For so long, I had tried to handle everything on my own, shutting out the people who cared about me the most. But now, more than ever, I needed to let someone in. I needed to talk to someone who could help me make sense of all the chaos swirling inside me. The thought of going home, of facing the reality of what had happened, terrified me. But I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. I had to make a decision about Daniel, about our marriage, about my future. When the day finally came for us to leave the resort, the tension between Daniel and me had reached its peak. We had spent the last few days in an uneasy truce, avoiding any real conversation about what had happened. But now, as we packed our bags and prepared to leave, I knew we couldn't avoid it any longer. The ride to the airport was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Every now and then, Daniel would glance over at me, his expression a mix of sadness and regret, but he didn't say anything. I think we both knew that whatever conversation we were going to have, it wasn't going to happen here, in the back of a taxi. It wasn't until we were sitting in the airport, waiting for our flight, that Daniel finally spoke. "What happens when we get home?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the airport. I turned to look at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I had been asking myself the same question for days, but I still didn't have an answer. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I need time. I need to figure out if I can move past this." He nodded, his expression solemn. "I understand, but I want you to know that I'm not giving up. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. I love you, and I'll wait as long as you need." I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of everything we had been through. I wanted to believe him, to believe that we could somehow find our way back to each other. But I wasn't sure if that was possible. "I don't know if love is enough anymore, Daniel," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I don't know if we can fix this." His face fell, and for a moment, I saw the fear in his eyes, the fear of losing me, of losing us. But he didn't argue. He just nodded, accepting the reality of the situation. "I'll do everything I can to show you that it is," he said softly. "But I'll give you the space you need." As we boarded the plane and settled into our seats, I stared out the window, watching as the world below grew smaller and smaller. I didn't know what the future held for us. I didn't know if we would survive this, or if this was the end of our story. All I knew was that, for now, I needed to heal, and I needed to figure out if I could ever trust Daniel again. The plane ride home felt like a transition between two worlds, the dream of what our life was supposed to be and the harsh reality of what it had become. Daniel sat beside me, his hand resting on his lap, close enough to touch but worlds away from me. I could feel the tension in him, the unspoken hope that I might reach out, that I might say something, anything, that would make everything better. But I couldn't. I needed space, and for once he seemed to understand that. As the plane descended and the city came into view, my heart sank. This was it. We were returning to our life, to our home, but it didn't feel the same. I didn't feel the same. The woman who had left for vacation, full of hope that the trip would reignite something between us, was gone. Now I was someone else, someone who had been hurt in a way I hadn't thought possible. When we landed, Daniel and I gathered our bags in silence. The airport was bustling with life, people reuniting with family, greeting each other with warm hugs. And yet, there we were, standing side by side, barely able to look at each other. It felt like the end of something, though I wasn't sure what. Outside, we stood waiting for a taxi. The air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the warmth of the beach we had left behind. It almost felt fitting, the coldness of it, like the reality of our situation settling in. Daniel looked over at me, his expression pained, but he didn't say anything. I think he knew that words wouldn't change anything right now. We got into the taxi, and the ride home was as quiet as the plane ride had been. The city passed by in a blur, familiar streets, familiar places, but everything felt different. When we finally pulled up to our house, I hesitated. I didn't want to go inside. I wasn't ready to face the life we had built, not with everything that had happened hanging over us. Daniel must have sensed it because he turned to me, his voice soft. "Do you want me to stay somewhere else for a while?" I looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to. I think it might be best," he said, his voice laced with regret. "You said you needed space, and I don't want to make things harder for you. Maybe a little time apart would help." I nodded slowly. "Maybe." He exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath. "I'll pack a few things and head to my brother's place. I'll give you the time you need." For a moment, I almost told him to stay. I almost asked him not to leave. But something inside me held back. I wasn't ready. I needed to figure out what I really wanted, if I even wanted this marriage anymore. After Daniel left, the house felt too quiet. It was strange how empty it seemed without him, even though the space was the same. I wandered from room to room, unsure of what to do with myself. Every corner of the house held memories, good ones, bad ones. But now they all felt tainted by what had happened. I found myself in the bedroom, staring at our bed. I hadn't slept in it since the night I found out about Lena. Even now, it felt like a place I couldn't return to, as if that betrayal had seeped into the very sheets. I ended up sleeping on the couch that night, curled up under a blanket, the quiet of the house pressing down on me. Days passed and I settled into a routine of sorts. I went to work, came home, tried to distract myself with anything I could. Books, TV, endless cups of tea. But no matter what I did, the emptiness remained. It was like a shadow that followed me everywhere, a constant reminder of the decision I still hadn't made. Daniel called every few days just to check in. He never pushed for more than I was willing to give. Our conversations were brief, awkward. He told me he was staying with his brother and that he was giving me as much space as I needed. But I could hear the longing in his voice, the desire for things to go back to the way they were. I wanted that too sometimes, but then I'd remember the messages, the look in his eyes when he tried to explain, and the hurt would wash over me all over again. It wasn't that simple. Trust didn't come back just because you wanted it to. One evening, about a week after Daniel had left, I finally picked up the phone and called Sarah. I had been putting it off, avoiding the conversation because I knew how hard it would be to say the words out loud. But I needed someone to talk to. I couldn't keep carrying this weight alone. When she answered, her voice was bright, full of warmth. "Hey, stranger. How was the vacation?" The question hit me like a punch. I had no idea how to answer it. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. It was complicated. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Complicated? What happened? I took a deep breath and started to tell her everything. About Lena, about the messages, about the betrayal that had shattered everything I thought I knew about my marriage. The words spilled out of me, raw and unfiltered, like I had been holding them back for too long. By the time I finished, there was a long stretch of silence. I could hear Sarah breathing, could imagine her sitting there, trying to process everything I had just told her. "I'm so sorry," she finally said, her voice soft. "I had no idea. I don't even know what to say." "It's okay," I said, though it wasn't. Nothing about this was okay. "I don't know what to do, Sarah. I don't know if I can forgive him." "Have you talked to him? Like, really talked?" "I've tried," I admitted. "But every time I think about forgiving him, I can't. I keep thinking about what he did, about how he turned to someone else when things got hard." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. "I think you need to figure out what you want. Forget about him for a second. What do you need to heal? Can you see yourself trusting him again? Because if you can't, then maybe it's time to think about moving on." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Moving on. I had been so focused on the idea of fixing things, of saving our marriage, that I hadn't really considered what it would mean if I couldn't. What if I couldn't forgive him? What if the trust was gone forever? "I don't know," I whispered, feeling the tears welling up in my eyes again. "I just don't know." "And that's okay," Sarah said. "You don't have to know right now. Just take it one day at a time. You'll figure it out." After that conversation with Sarah, something shifted in me. I still didn't have all the answers, but I realized that I had been putting too much pressure on myself to figure it all out right away. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe I didn't need to decide everything at once. Maybe it was okay to take things one step at a time, to allow myself to feel everything I needed to feel. Over the next few days, I gave myself permission to focus on me, on my healing, on what I needed. I went for long walks, took bubble baths, let myself cry when the weight of it all became too much. Slowly, I started to feel a little more like myself again, though the hurt was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. Daniel called again, his voice careful as always. "How are you?" he asked, his words cautious. "I'm okay," I said, and for the first time I almost meant it. "I've been thinking, maybe we should try talking, like really talking. Maybe we need to see if there's anything left to save." I could hear the relief in his voice, the hope that flared up at my words. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "Whenever you're ready." "I'm not promising anything," I warned him, "but I think we need to try." That weekend, Daniel came back to the house for the first time since he had left. I was nervous, unsure of what to expect, unsure of how I would feel seeing him again. When he walked through the door, it felt strange, like seeing a familiar face after years apart, even though it had only been a few weeks. We sat down at the kitchen table, both of us fidgeting, unsure of how to begin. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything that had happened hung between us, heavy and unspoken. "I don't even know where to start," Daniel admitted, his voice shaky. "But I'm here, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes to fix this, if that's what you want." I looked at him, searching his face for the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. He was still there, somewhere beneath the hurt and the mistakes. But the question was, could I find? I looked at Daniel, his face etched with regret and a desperate hope that maybe, somehow, we could find our way back to each other. But as I sat there, searching his eyes for answers, I realized something I hadn't been able to admit until now. I had changed. We had changed. And no matter how much we both wanted to, we couldn't go back to who we were before. It wasn't just about the affair, though that was a wound that would take years to heal. It was about the cracks that had already formed between us long before Lena entered the picture. The slow drift, the unspoken resentments, the distance we both allowed to grow. Maybe we had been ignoring it for too long, pretending everything was fine when deep down we knew it wasn't. I wanted to forgive him. I wanted to believe that love was enough, that we could rebuild what had been broken. But the truth was, some things couldn't be fixed. Some things were too shattered to put back together. "I don't know if I can do this," I finally said, my voice breaking. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. I don't know if I can trust you." Daniel's face fell, his eyes filling with the kind of pain I hadn't seen in him before. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. We can work through this. Don't give up on us." "I'm not giving up," I said softly, wiping away a tear that had slipped down my cheek. "But maybe this is the end for us. Maybe the best thing we can do is let each other go." The words felt heavy, final, but they were the truth. For weeks, I had been trying to hold on to the idea of us, to the life we had built together. But now, sitting across from him, I realized that letting go didn't mean we had failed. It just meant that our time together had run its course. Daniel looked at me, his eyes pleading, but deep down, I could see that he knew it too. He knew that this was the end of the road for us. Slowly, he nodded, the fight leaving him. "I love you," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "I always will." "I love you too," I whispered. "But sometimes, love isn't enough." For a long time, we sat there in silence, the weight of our decisions settling over us like a blanket of finality. There were no more words to say, no more apologies to offer. We had reached the end. It took time, months, even, for me to come to terms with everything that had happened. The divorce was amicable, but it wasn't easy. Saying goodbye to Daniel, to the life we had shared, was one of the hardest things I had ever done. But as painful as it was also a release. A letting go of the past and a step toward something new. In the months that followed, I found myself again. I focused on me, on healing, on rediscovering who I was outside of our marriage. I started spending more time with friends, pursuing hobbies I had long neglected. Slowly, the pain of Daniel's betrayal faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance. Not everything was meant to last forever, and that was okay. As for Daniel, we stayed in touch, though the conversations became less frequent over time. He seemed to be doing his own healing, finding his own way forward. We both knew that what we had shared was special, but it wasn't meant to last. One afternoon, as I stood on the beach, watching the waves roll in, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The ocean had become a place of reflection for me, a reminder of the ebb and flow of life, of how things could change and yet still carry on. I wasn't the same person I had been before, but in many ways I was stronger. I had survived the storm, and now I was ready for whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time I wasn't afraid. I had learned that sometimes the hardest choices were the ones that set us free, and in the end that was enough.